Good evening, everybody. I think we've already greeted each other. Some of my slides may not be up to the mark, but I will speak about it. This is about precocious puberty, which can be a little confusing to address. I'll start off with a case presentation and then we will build up the concepts on this. A girl child, because this is what we see most, we see precocious puberty development most commonly in girls. See, a 6.5-year-old who has come to us with a chief complaint of breast enlargement, noticed around 6 weeks ago. The parents, the concerned parents, bring the child. And the questions that go through our mind is whether it's a precocious puberty or it's one of the variants. And do we need to investigate? And if so, what will tell us how far to investigate? Would treatment be required in case it turns out to be precocious puberty? And from the mother's perspective, it will be when will she attain menarche? Usually the parents think that the moment the child shows pubertal signs, menarche is around the corner, maybe in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But that's not true. We know that an average age, it's an average age of about 2 years from the onset of breast development that menarche occurs. So we can reassure the mother that way. And for us doctors, we are very concerned about the final height, whether it's going to be compromised, which may not be an issue with the parents because they're not aware of it. So first is, when do we see it's precocious puberty? There are two criteria. One is the age of onset of pubertal signs, and second is that by itself is not enough. Also, there is a tempo, the rate of progression. So this is the traditional definition of precocious puberty, that is breast development before the age of 8 years in girls and testicular enlargement of greater than 4 ml in boys before the age of 9 years. I will show you the Prader's oxidometer. Yeah. There is a Prader's oxidometer with which we assess the testicular volume, or if we do not have a Prader's oxidometer, a testicular length of greater than 2.5 centimeters is the first sign of puberty in boys, 2.2 actually. So if we don't have an oxidometer, we can just use that to assess whether the boy has entered puberty. Now this age, cutoff age is subject to some kind of revision, which has not yet been accepted universally, because there have been some 2 studies in the US that have shown that puberty may actually start a little earlier and still be considered as normal. Say in blacks at around 6.5 years, and in the white girls about 7.5 years. So the cutoff has become lower, but still it has not yet become the standard accepted definition as yet. So that is one thing. And breast development in girls aged between 7 to 8 years is a gray zone, because it's been referred to as accelerated puberty or early normal puberty or rapidly progressive Thelarche variant. So this is the age of onset. Now the progression, is it progressive? So when do we say progressive? If there is a pubertal growth velocity. So when we use there are growth velocity charts available, and when we mark the growth velocity, if it's over of course we need 2 measurements to be able to assess growth velocity measurements and then plot it on the velocity curves. But if it's over 75th percentile, then it is an accelerated growth velocity. But I will tell you a few other points wherein we can make to even without the growth velocity curves, because most of our patients do not have previous height measurements. They just come to us for the first time. And bone age, because bone age reflects the physiological maturation, and if it's greater than 2 standard deviations for chronological age, or if the bone age upon chronological age is greater than 1.2, then we could say it is an accelerated pubertal development. So both the criteria have to be met in order to say it is precocious puberty. So these are some, over the years, I found these things to be useful because our population doesn't have height measurements, which books say you have to go by that. So we may, if the no height measurements and if we feel the bone age is not very advanced, say within 2 years of chronological age, we can still wait and watch. We have time. We call the child back for review after 4 months to assess growth velocity. Or there are some indirect ways. Suppose the child, they ask the parents, was the child of average height in class, say last year, and now is among the tallest. So the comparative assessment with regards to the peers will tell us whether the child has had a growth acceleration indirectly. And also when we put the child's height on the growth chart and project it, on that curve we project it, and it falls way above the mid-parental height, then too that child may be having an accelerated growth. These are the things that we could use when we don't have previous height measurement, clinically at the first instance itself. So we should also see for other signs on clinical examination. For when a child presents with breast development, it's important to say breast development is an evidence of estrogen action. We have to see whether there are other signs of estrogen action. So the estrogen sensitive tissues are the uterus and the vaginal mucosa, labia minora, all these show changes due to estrogen action. So the labia minora thickening and increased clear mucus secretion. The labia minora in prepubertal girls is thin and leaf-like. It's a very thin thing, whereas when puberty sets in, you find a thickening of the labia minora with increased clear mucus secretion. And the vaginal mucosa, which is glistening, it's glistening and red, bright red in appearance in a non-estrogenized, whereas it becomes around pale pink color when because of cornification of the vaginal mucosa. And also there will be some amount of clear mucus secretion on the vaginal mucosa. So these help us in telling that there is estrogen. It's not just limited to breast development, which could be premature thelarchy, but it could be a precocious puberty because there are other tissues also showing signs of estrogen action like this externally. And when we do an ultrasound, which I'll come to, we see a uterine volume. The cutoff between puberty and prepubertal uterine volume is 3.5 ml.
Can we just measure the estrogen levels in the blood?
Yes, estrogen levels can be measured. If it's borderline high, then it could still fall in the premature. But always we should have clinical impression. We shouldn't just, these are all clinical signs. Otherwise we'll be so dependent on the lab. Sometimes you get labs which don't match our clinical signs and we don't want to. So we have to approach a case first clinically. I'll come to the labs, but clinical assessment gives 90% or 95% of the diagnosis actually. In fact, in many cases it's 100%. Because even the bone age, I will come to that. If we learn our teeth, how dentition erupts, and when the primary teeth are shed, the sequence of shedding of primary dentition, that goes hand in hand with bone age. So even before we get a bone age, say in an 8 or 9 year old or 8-year-old, you find the bicuspids, upper bicuspids have erupted. That's an advance. You know that the bone age is going to be 10 or 11, because the premolars have no business to be there in an 8-year-old. So if we know our teeth, so these are all very useful clinical clues, and we should gather as many clinical clues and have an assessment before we order labs. Otherwise, we'll be sitting with a whole bunch of labs and breaking our heads over how to match them to the clinical signs. So definitely labs we could, but this is clinical tips which we can. So this is it. So these are indirect features of growth acceleration, which I've already discussed. And so let us come back to this child. We get a bone age which is 8 years and 10 months. So it is definitely advanced. This is a 6.5-year-old child with a bone age of more than 2 years beyond the chronological age. And the height prediction, there is a way of predicting height using the Bailey and Pinot charts, which are behind the Grulich and Pyle Atlas. So the height prediction was 59 inches, which is not very good. It's less than 5 feet. And it's way below the mid-parental height. When you project the child's present height to the final height, when you consider the mid-parental height and you see the height prediction, they don't match. It falls way below the mid-parental height. So do you think this child needs further investigation and treatment? Maybe. Do you? Who thinks this child, or should we just send and observe her, send her home and observe?
She needs
she needs, because the height prediction is definitely less than 5 feet. We don't want to take a chance there. So this is how, with just a few things we can make out. You know, precocious puberty is very simple initially to approach, and then, so is this precocious puberty? It is rapidly progressive. There are early pubertal signs. It's rapidly progressive because bone age is advanced, and probably the history also tells that she's shot up over the previous 6 months to 8 months. She's been gaining weight because pubertal growth is associated with increased subcutaneous fat in girls and increased muscle mass in boys. So this rounding and weight gain and growth spurt which the mother has observed over the previous 6 months, that gives us an indicator that it's a progressive form, rapidly progressive. So this is indeed precocious puberty. Now, clinically, is it central or peripheral? So how do we say that? In peripheral precocity, there is typically a very short history. The parents will say, like, if it's an ovarian cyst that is producing estrogens, or say McCune-Albright syndrome, which has suddenly started having the ovaries become autonomous and producing estrogens, then there will be a very short history. The history will be something like some amount of breast enlargement and tenderness, which may be Tanner 2, just above, breast not significant. You know, menarche is a late pubertal event. Menarche occurs at a Tanner stage of 3 to 4, breast development. But here you may find breast enlargement of Tanner 2 early stages with menstrual bleed. That is because very high levels of estrogens are produced, but the duration is not long enough to cause all the changes. Bone age may not be advanced, and there is that sequence of pubertal development we do not see. So asymmetry in puberty, progression of secondary sexual characteristics in a child who presents with pubertal signs of a very short duration, you know, two things like this, breast development and periods happening in say 1 or 2 months, we should think of peripheral precocity. And there is not much advancement of bone age, because bone age to be advanced needs more longer estrogen action, which won't be there in precocious, peripheral precocity. This growth velocity also to increase to be demonstrable requires a greater estrogen exposure, greater period of estrogen exposure, which may not be there in peripheral precocity. And ultrasound may show unilateral ovarian enlargement. Ovarian volume of greater than 1 ml bilaterally is indicative of LH action. Correct? Because it's centrally mediated and it stimulates both the ovaries equally. So bilateral ovarian enlargement of greater than 1 ml and a uterine volume of greater than 3.5 ml is an ultrasound feature suggestive of central precocious puberty. If one of the ovaries is big and one of the ovaries is small, then it could be a peripheral precocious puberty. So this is what the ultrasound shows in peripheral precocious puberty. Of course, this is basically with girls. I will touch upon boys' precocious puberty also. I will just say later on. So does this child have central or peripheral precocious puberty clinically? I want you to. Clinically, this child, does she have central or peripheral? Central. Why is it central?
Because her
the bone age is advanced.
Bone age advanced, breast tissue is enlarged. Her, what else? Dentition is advanced.
And ovarian volume bilaterally is over. So these all indicate, even clinically we can make out whether it is precocious puberty or not. Then we can come to the hormones. So before we go on to the laboratory testing of precocious puberty, there are some variants which we need to keep in mind, which is premature thelarche. Basically, there are two categories of premature thelarche which have different implications. One is a persistence of neonatal breast enlargement. You know, we see maybe an 8-month-old baby come in with breast enlargement. And when we ask, they say, yes, in the newborn period, somebody was trying to express and they found some lumps and it has been persisting. But they come to us at 8 months. So this is, most of the time it is, it's just premature thelarche, it doesn't progress. In fact, by 2 years, there could be some regression or no progression. So that's what it is. And in fact, one more clinical clue actually is the areola. Estrogen has effect on the areolar diameter and appearance darkening. which you don't find in premature thelarchy. You know, if you observe the contour of breast and the areolar diameter and enlargement and darkening, when you find that the areolar diameter is increased and there is darkened, then it means that there could be a more intense estrogen action. It may not be a premature thelarchy. You know, these are all some clinical clues. So if there is history that's persistence or increase of palpable tissue that is present at birth, this fits into this category. And as a consequence, because during birth there is what is called as mini puberty of the newborn, because the cerebral cortex starts inhibiting the hypothalamic pulse generator, but that axis to be matured, it takes about 2 years. So till then there could be pulses of which could actually confuse us when we do the test whether it's puberty or not. You know, very early stages it could be a pubertal LH response. So it's usually associated with that kind of thing, and it often regresses by 24 months of age. Now greater than 2 years, regression is not observed, and this is enhanced. This is due to enhanced follicular development, and it's typically associated with FSH predominance. You know, premature thelarchy is mainly associated with FSH predominance, and studies now have found that it's because of inhibin B secretion. So this, we have to keep this child under observation. We may say it's premature thelarchy, but we don't know. Sometimes at some point it just the child will start going into true precocity. So we have to follow up this child. And estradiol levels and skeletal age should be obtained if we are in doubt, and which may be normal or slightly advanced, even in premature thelarchy. But premature thelarchy that begins after 2 years, we need to keep them under observation, because the transition can happen to central precocity. We have to follow them up every 6 months. So in all cases of precocious pubertal development, we need to screen for hypothyroidism, because we know that increased it's the TSH and the FSH LH, they share sequence homology, the alpha subunits, and that in turn can cause elevated levels, can cause some amount of
TRH can stimulate both.
Yes. TRH
can stimulate both the TSH and
it can stimulate prolactin and thyroid stimulating hormone, but the thyroid stimulating hormone shares sequence homology with FSH and LH. So that can stimulate follicular enlargement and some amount of estrogen. So you find in severe cases of primary hypothyroidism, sometimes they come with menstrual bleed, but the bone age is very, very delayed. See, this kind of discrepancy happens. You will find florid signs of hypothyroidism with delayed bone age but a menstrual bleed. Very severe, long-standing hypothyroidism. So, and this is another, I think it's a major cause nowadays for early pubertal development and exposure to environmental estrogens. We have a lot of environmental endocrine disruptors, especially with plastics. The bisphenol A, that is associated with both premature thelarchy as well as precocious puberty. It's a very dangerous chemical, bisphenol A in plastics. So,
what plastics will be?
They say food grade and all that, but even food grade, when you scrub it, sometimes the protective coating goes and we don't know how safe is the so-called food grade. So it's better to switch over to steel, good old steel glass, which is what I have done.
Microwave and heat the food and then they eat.
Yeah, we don't know, because there are no studies that have shown that these kind of these containers versus that containers and all that. But we know that the protective coating can get damaged of all these plastics, and that can expose bisphenol A, and that is it has been known to cause infertility in males also. Male infertility, PCOD, precocious puberty, premature thelarchy, all these things are linked to plastics, environmentally endocrine disruptors. Okay, I mean, I tried to get in a few slides, but I couldn't. So this is about precocious puberty in girls. Hypothalamic hamartoma is another thing to be considered in a child who shows precocious pubertal development around 2 to 4 years of age. They can present with delayed development, seizures, and it is central. It is gonadotropin dependent precocious puberty. And I wanted to put in a slide for the hormonal test. to confirm before starting treatment, we need to do what is called as a GnRH stimulation test. But that, now we do analogs because the gonadorolene is no longer available. We use decapeptyl, 100 micrograms per meter square body surface area, and 3 hours later we check LH, FSH. It's predominantly the LH response we study. If it's greater than 8 units per liter, then it indicates central precocious puberty. That is a GnRH analog testing. That's the protocol. I couldn't get it. So the treatment of precocious puberty as of now is long-acting GnRH analog, which down-regulates the GnRH pulse net rate and suppresses puberty. Do you want me to talk on adrenarche, puberty? I think 15 minutes is over.
Any cost?
So what about the plastics you were talking, BPA?
That's about it. I mean, it has estrogenic action. It's an estrogen mimetic. So it can trigger off premature telarche, and also if sustained, any peripheral precocious puberty can cause central, it can lead to central over prolonged. We know in congenital adrenal hyperplasia it happens.
What about all the foodstuffs which are hormone modulated? Does that have any implication on the precocious? Like, for example, the vegetables, of course, and also chicken.
I'm sure, because I think I had read a paper some time back somewhere in the Gulf. They were treating, I think it was the chicken, they were treating it with some hormonal preparations, and there was a kind of like a spurt in cases of precocious puberty. Yes. So, but we don't have any way of checking it now practically. And many of these insecticides like DDT and those family of compounds also have estrogenic actions. Organochlorine compounds.
So what's the answer?
It should be a government policy.
Organic, everything should be organic.
Organic.
And
Grow your own grains, huh?
What could be the cause? Genetic also plays a role in precocious puberty, or just?
Yeah, in most cases, it's in girls especially, it's idiopathic. There have been some studies that have shown some mutations. Recent study, I can't remember what mutations that trigger off central precocious puberty. But we need to rule out secondary causes which are very rare in girls, like CNS tumors, optic gliomas, cranial irradiation, or perinatal asphyxia, encephalopathy. This could all reset our axis in the brain. So these could also be responsible for precocious puberty. Normally we don't do an MRI in every case of central precocious puberty, especially in these slightly older children. Maybe less than 4 years we do need to do, because hematoma is a big possibility there. But otherwise we don't do.
So breast enlargement is one of the features. What about axillary hair or pubic hair?
Correct. See, that's what. Axillary hair and pubic hair is basically androgen dependent, and it's adrenal androgen dependent. At around 5 to 6 years of age, there is a phenomenon called adrenarche. That is, the adrenal gland matures. And when that gets, usually the levels of DHEA sulfate, which is a marker of adrenal androgens, it's exclusively produced in the adrenal gland. It goes up to about 40 milligrams per dl, and that is an accepted thing for adrenarche. In some cases of adrenarche, that translates into pubarche, that is pubic hair growth, and it's usually a benign thing. There may be slight advancement of bone age. Children finally reach up to their final height, predicted height, even though there is slight advancement of bone age. But we need to keep two things in mind here. One is what is called as a non-classical congenital adrenal hyperplasia. There could be partial deficiencies of the adrenal enzymes like 21-hydroxylase or 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, and that needs to be picked up. And there are studies, and that can be done by doing a 17-hydroxyprogesterone 8 am. It's over 3 nanograms per ml. Then we need to do an ACTH stimulation test to make sure it's not non-classical congenital adrenal hyperplasia. It's not very common, but that is something that we need to think of, especially when the bone age is advanced, when the growth velocity seems to be a little faster. and the child may or may not be having some hyperpigmentation. You know, because it's a very mild form of adrenal insufficiency, you may not find hyperpigmentation. So in such cases, we'll also have to do a 17-hydroxyprogesterone level and testosterone. If there's a differential diagnosis of premature puberty, is non-classical CH1, and 15% of children, girls, can present with pubic hair growth as a first sign of puberty. Most of them present with breast enlargement, but 15% of the girls can present with pubic hair. So these are the two things that needs to be kept in mind when we approach a case of puberty.
So you're saying if there's a puberty, you would want a DEHEAS?
No, I would want a bone age probably.
Okay.
And even before that, I would check the dentition, you know. It's very, very useful actually. If we learn about 4-5 patients, if we just keep the thing and match the next patients, you will know which teeth have come out earlier. So that.
As dentists, we tend to rely on hand-based radiographs.
Correct.
To check for
No, that is the final, but clinical impression, you know.
The bone age can be how much discrepant from the actual age as a normal variant?
In puberty, acceptable maybe about the ratio, no? 1.2. 1.2 ratio of
Bone age
bone age over
chronological age.
Okay, now this might not be a very clear sign, but some parents do say body odor. The girls or the boys start having a
Correct.
adult body odor. So does that have anything
No,
to
that's
do?
again adrenarche.
Adrenarche.
See, only a certain percentage of them shows pubic hair growth, and then we have to think of the other differently.
So these patients have to be evaluated. We should not just let them
May
go.
not be just
No?
body odor. Maybe we could call them for a growth velocity assessment later on, 4 months later. Whether it is, childhood, typically about 5, 6, 7 years, the average growth rate is about 5 centimeters a year. So we measure the height increase in those 4 months, actually in the number of days in those 4 months, divided by 365, and divided by the number of days. The height difference divided by number of days into 365 gives us the growth velocity per year. So if it's usually about 5 centimeters per year at that age. So these are basically clinical. We can arrive at a lot of things. We just clinical.
Which is referred to you.
That's
So much
easy.
easier.
Good evening to all the doctors and visiting consultants of teleradiology. My presentation today is on approaches to maxillofacial trauma. Now, maxillofacial trauma is present in 30% of all the trauma cases. Now, the cause of this facial trauma can be varied. It can be road traffic accidents, it can be interpersonal violence, it can be falls, it can be sports injuries, it could be industrial accidents. Now, there are very few epidemiological studies on facial trauma in India, and even those that are present are mainly retrospective in nature. The treatment as far as maxillofacial trauma is concerned can be divided into 4 phases, that is emergency or initial care, where all our ABCs comes into the picture: airway, breathing, circulation. Early care, then definitive care, which is what I will be mainly stressing about today, then secondary care or revision. Now, early care is after emergency care has stabilized the patient. In this phase, basically you carry out debridement and dressing of soft tissues. An elective tracheostomy is performed if it is deemed necessary. Physical examination and history of the patient has to be taken thoroughly, and laboratory tests are there is requisition for laboratory tests, and a thorough examination of the head and neck area will help us to arrive at the diagnosis of maxillofacial injuries. Now, diagnosis of maxillofacial injuries is arrived with inspection, palpation, and diagnostic imaging. Now, in inspection, basically you look for hemorrhage in the entire head and neck area. Especially relevant is otorrhea and rhinorrhea, because you could expect CSF otorrhea and CSF rhinorrhea in facial-maxillary injuries associated with head injury patients. And contour deformity, ecchymosis like in this picture here. Then edema, continuity defects, and malocclusion. Now malocclusion is any deviation from the normal biting pattern of a patient, and which as dentists we are sort of like experts in diagnosing malocclusion. Then you can also look for sublingual ecchymosis, that is basically ecchymosis in the undersurface of the tongue when there is a fracture of the lower jaw, the mandible. You can also expect step deformity, ridge discontinuity, and malocclusion. On palpation, basically we look for step defect or crepitus, that is the grating sound between bony fragments or any mobility of the jaw segments. Coming to the imaging, basically here we have plain films, CT scan or stereolithography when it is available. In plain films, the OPG or the orthopantomogram still remains as the gold standard for entire spectrum of maxillofacial imaging. When the facility of CT scan is available, it's obviously much better because you have more, because you're able to sort of diagnose fractures at more precise levels. And this is how 3D CT reconstruction would look like in this patient is an example of a massive trauma. And taking it one more step further, basically this is stereolithography where the CAD/CAM technology is employed, and you can get a model like this, which will help us in the execution of the treatment plan. Coming to the definitive care, you have the soft tissue injuries initially which need to be managed. So this includes contusions, abrasions, and lacerations. And facial lacerations which are not complicated by any associated injury can be managed in an emergency room setting or the casualty setting. But large extensive facial and scalp lacerations have to be managed in an operating room setting. So the sequence of managing a soft tissue injuries is hemostasis, debridement, approximating the wound edges, and giving a dressing. Of course, antibiotics and tetanus toxoid also will have to be administered. Now, this is an example of a facial laceration patient in whom this entire sequence of steps was followed. We also need to be careful about a few structures in our facial area. These are of which we need to emphasize specifically, that is the lacrimal system in the orbital area, parotid duct, and the facial nerve. Coming to the individual bones, mandible is the second most common fractured facial bone, the first being the nasal, and 50% of the mandible fractures are multiple fractures, that is you can have more than one fracture in the lower jaw. So it is important to examine the patient and the radiograph closely and suspect any additional fracture. So it is very common to miss out a fracture in the condyle region because all our focus is on the anterior aspect of the mandible. So you can have a fracture in the condyle which can be missed out. Now the clinical signs and symptoms are tenderness and pain, malocclusion, ecchymosis in the floor of the mouth, the sublingual ecchymosis which I just described. You can have mucosal lacerations, step defects in the lower border of the mandible, and you can have cranial nerve disturbances in the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. The fifth trigeminal nerve is fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve. So the third branch in this trigeminal nerve is the mandibular branch. So you can have disturbances of the fifth cranial nerve. The treatment depends on the fracture site and the amount of segment displacement. So you have two options mainly, that is closed reduction and open reduction. So closed reduction is achieved with IMF. With IMF, this is something called as an Eric's arch bar, and basically we use wires to secure the fragments. We are just basically approximating the fragments. We are not opening the fracture site and putting any plates. On the other hand, open reduction and internal fixation is the other modality. So here we are opening the fracture site and using both plates and screws to fix the mandible. Coming to mid-face fractures, you have Leefort 1, 2, and 3. Then you have the zygomatic complex, orbital floor, nasal fractures, and the naso-orbital ethmoid complex fractures. The Leefort classification is a popular classification. This was the result of work done by one French surgeon called René Leefort in 1901. So he identified the weakest areas of the mid-facial complex when assaulted from a frontal direction at different levels. This is basically a result of a cadaveric study. So Lefort 1 is at the level of the tooth, Lefort 2 is at the level of nasal bones, and Lefort 3 is at the orbital level. Lefort 1 is also known as a transverse maxillary fracture. So as it has been described, you can make out that it is at the level of the tooth. Then Lefort 2 is a little higher at the nasal level. It's also called the pyramidal fracture. And Lefort 3 is even more higher. It is basically the separation of the cranium and the facial bones. So the diagnosis of Lefort 1 fracture depends on the direction of the force. When the maxilla is displaced posteriorly and inferiorly, you can expect an open bite deformity. The patient is not able to close his mouth. You can expect decreased sensation of the infraorbital area, infraorbital nerve. Then there is malocclusion, and mobility of the maxilla also can be elicited by grasping the maxillary incisors. The treatment is direct exposure of all the involved fractures, reduction and anatomic realignment of the maxillary buttress to re-establish the anterior projection, because there is an open bite deformity. Then the transverse bit, and the key thing is the occlusion. So restoration of occlusion is achieved using intermaxillary fixation. Internal fixation is done using mini plates. So this is an example of a Lefort 1 fracture. So here we have used a bone plate to fix the fractured segment at the Lefort 1 level. Now Lefort 2 and 3 basically we rely on we can't completely rely on clinical evaluation, because it only provides a rough impression since there will be a lot of edema there which hides the underlying bony structures. So plain film radiographs and axial and coronal CT images are the basis for precise diagnosis and treatment plan. You can expect bilateral periorbital edema and ecchymosis. Then there is step deformity that is palpable in the infraorbital and the nasofrontal area. And you can expect CSF rhinorrhea and epistaxis. The treatment, the fracture should be treated as early as the general condition of the patient allows. So here there is a need for a team approach. The neurosurgeon, ophthalmologist, ENT surgeon, plastic surgeon, and the oral and maxillofacial surgeon can all contribute in the execution of treatment. Intubation is a key consideration in Lefort 2 and 3 fractures, because we need to check the occlusion. So obviously oral intubation is not desirable. We generally prefer a nasal intubation, but you can also expect simultaneously epistaxis and rhinorrhea. So you have other options also like submental intubation, but the choice of intubation is critical, because intraoperatively you have to check the occlusion. Then exposure and visualization of all fractures is carried out mainly through these 3 approaches, that is the periorbital approach, the coronal approach, which can be bicoronal when it's from one preauricular region to the other preauricular region, or a heavy coronal approach when it's from one preauricular region to the center of the scalp. The gingivo-buccal incision is an intraoral approach. Now, one point that I'd like to stress is that the teeth and occlusion are the key to reconstruction and provide the foundation upon which the other facial structures are built. So, to achieve precise anatomic reduction and fixation, the teeth and the occlusion play a key role. And this is a schematic diagram of Lefort 2 and 3 fractures, and if you look at the areas where the plating has been done, this is the frontozygomatic area, this is the infraorbital area, this is the zygomatic buttress, and this is the arch, zygomatic arch that has been plated. Then this schematic diagram basically describes a situation wherein almost all the facial bones have been fractured. So this is basically a panfacial fracture. So here again we rely on the teeth and the occlusion as the key consideration upon which the other things are reconstructed. Now coming to orbit, now orbit basically comprises 7 facial bones, that is frontal, zygomatic, ethmoid, lacrimal, maxilla, palatal, and sphenoid. Now orbit is closely associated with 2 other fractures. When it is involved in the lateral aspect, it is the zygomatic complex that it is associated with, and when it is on the medial side, it is with the nasoethmoid complex. So this is an example of the zygomatic fractures which results from lateral forces, and this basically includes the frontozygomatic suture area here. Then this is the zygomatic arch, and then the zygomatic buttress area here, and the infraorbital region. So these 4 points are basically constitute the zygomatic So your treatment is basically to achieve at least 3-point fixation. So probably you could sacrifice one area since you are achieving 3-point fixation. And this is one of the cases done recently. So in this case, we can see a left maxilla and a zygomatic buttress that has been involved here. So the fracture line is running all the way along the anterior surface of the maxilla till the zygomatic buttress area. Now, a lot of times impacted zygoma can mask an orbital floor defect, so the diagnosis becomes very important. More than executing the treatment plan, the diagnosis probably is more important in mid-phase fractures. One more terminology that you might be familiar with is blowout fractures. So this is when inferior end of the medial wall of the orbit is involved. So here there is muscle entrapment which can cause double vision or diplopia. And there can also be herniation of the orbital fat into the maxillary sinus, as described here. So this is in brief about maxillofacial injuries. I'd like to thank Dr. Beliappa and Dr. Siddharth for the opportunity.
Thank you,
And
sir.
also Dr. Ghana and Dr. Girishankar for the constant education.
Are you doing all these? Can you do the surgeries here?
Sir, I think one case had come here. I think it was last month. One trauma case I have seen here. I think.
No, the OT, can you use it?
Yeah, we can.
You
There
can
is a
do
patient here.
fractures, you can do surgeries
We
here?
have not seen the OT. Yeah, but I think we can.
I'll take you
Yeah.
down.
I-
You didn't know there was an OT here.
Oh.
You did not know there was an OT.
I knew there was an OT.
Okay.
I think one patient I have seen last month.
So only 2 and 3 required surgery, you say?
So 2 and for 2 and 3 is more extensive. Usually it is like a team approach. Usually the neurosurgeon has to get involved in that. Only after the neurosurgeon gives us clearance, then we will do a fixation of bone plates. On the other hand, mandible and simple mid-phase fractures, we can do it under local or under general anesthesia, or maybe sedation. There are 3 options.
So you can let him look at.
Yes, definitely it can be done under local anesthesia. We can do it in a dental chair setting also.
Thank you.
Okay, first slide will be about my training. I have a 6-month, I did a pain management course in acupuncture with Helms Medical Institute affiliated with UCLA. And this was specifically meant for board certified physicians. They came from different disciplines, internal medicine, anesthesia, critical care, etc. This is Dr. Joseph Helms, who was my teacher. He's the main person who's in the US who's setting standards for acupuncture, and he's also introduced acupuncture for pain management with the US military now. Basically, what is acupuncture? It's a very old Chinese medicine, more than 3,000 years old, and it involves placement of tiny needles in precise acupuncture points, and it helps the body to return to a state of harmony, equilibrium, and health. So this slide is about the microcosms. Chinese always believe that every organ in the body shows tiny representations of all the other organs. So you see the palm, and I think in India they do a lot of Korean acupuncture, and I hear patients, people telling me that there are practitioners doing this palm acupuncture. As you see, there's a representation of all the different organs on the palm, and then the ear also. The mapping has been already done. Chinese have discovered the different points in the ear representing almost every organ. Same with the foot. And this is about the acupuncture meridians. On the left side you see the 6 major meridians, 3 yin meridians and 3 yang meridians. And body is crisscrossed by these meridians and cut into symmetric portions by the 6 meridians. They occupy specific locations. And the other interesting thing is that according to this medicine, the philosophy is that every human being belongs to one particular biopsychotype among the 6 different varieties, and depending upon the predominance of the meridian. is a little complex. Let's say Shaoyang, the middle one, what you see on the left hand side. If a person has a predominant Shaoyang meridian, he is expected to fall into conformity with one particular biocytotype. So this person typically has the big shoulders, he's well muscled, and he's like a CEO type. He's gung-ho, he's very confident, and this will be his personality. And this meridian represents the musculoskeletal system. If you see the last picture, the man on the side, the Shaoyang courses the body on the side, representing the musculoskeletal system. And this kind of an individual, if he falls sick, then the kind of diseases that he is going to get will also conform to the musculoskeletal system. So the one can expect a Shaoyang personality to have tendon-related problems, plantar fasciitis, tennis elbow, different things. So what the Chinese believe is that when you are going to fix a plantar fasciitis, say a heel spur, you're not only going to put local points to fix a heel spur, but you're also going to correct the meridian. You're going to make sure that the energy flow through the meridian is okay. So you fix the person, the personality as a whole, and establish proper flow in the energy channels. So this is their belief. How does the acupuncture work? Imbalances are supposed to occur when the flow of energy, also called as qi in the Chinese language, when the qi is interrupted. Pain is believed to be a manifestation of blocked qi. The acupuncture practitioner locates the points that should be treated in order to restore the correct flow of qi. The Western, initially the science evolved in China, and it went to, all this literature was translated to Latin at some point of time, and the Germans and French picked up this particular science, and when they did their experiments, they found out that the needles create stimuli to stimulate the nervous system, and they found out that there were endorphins and dynorphins being released. And this is very much consistent with the fact that people, after they get the acupuncture, they kind of feel sleepy, they have a feeling of elation. It's kind of indirectly conforming to this finding. And about the number of treatments, it depends upon the nature of the problem, the individual's underlying health and chronicity of the disease. 1 or 2 treatments may be sufficient for a mild injury or an acute problem. In some cases, it could take several series of 10 to 12 treatments over a period of months. And usually after 2 or 3 treatments, we know which way the thing is going. I usually tell my patients, if you're not having any relief with 2 or 3 patients, then there's no need to waste money. And if they're having a relief, come back for more treatments. That's what I've been telling my patients. This is a picture of the auriculotherapy. You see a beautiful picture of an inverted embryo. The earlobe is actually the head of the baby, and in the second ear picture, you see all the entire vertebral column. You see all the hand and the foot all nicely shown. There's also a picture of metal handled copper needles being placed. So the theory is that you find out where the hot spot is there, and you needle it, and you're supposed to address the pain or whatever disease you're addressing. This slide is for Dr. Siddha, and he wanted to know about moxibustion. This moxa is originally made from a substance called mugwort, and it looks like a Cuban cigar. And the idea is that you heat up the needles so that the heat is directly transmitted to the acupuncture point through the needle, and the effect of the needle placement is magnified by this. Also, the smell is somewhat soothing, and people find it nice. It has a soothing effect. This is the picture of the electroacupuncture. On the top picture, we see the needles in place, electricity in place for tennis elbow. In the bottom one, you see the needles for osteoarthritis of the knee. These are the conditions that can be treated. Acupuncture has actually been approved for over 40 diseases. If you ask the Chinese, they would say they can treat every disease with acupuncture, but a lot of research has been done, and they have confirmed that acupuncture does make a statistically significant difference in over 40 diseases. Traditionally, orthopedic problems are more amenable for treatment. You can use it for all kinds of back pain, neck pain, different joints. And in GYN, you have the infertility treatment that can be used simultaneously with the in vitro fertilization. You can use it for menorrhagia and postmenopausal symptoms. ENT, you can use it for otitis media, blocked ears, especially in situations where you may have to use ear tubes. You can avoid it by doing the acupuncture treatment. You can use it for headaches, substance addiction, including smoking, alcohol, drugs, and also it can be used for hemorrhoids and interstitial cystitis and kidney stones. May sound a little bizarre, but it has been used with good results. Some of the conditions that I have personally treated, I have them underlined. Adverse consequences, pneumothorax. If you put the needle very deep in the chest area, that's number one complication, pneumothorax. So we got to be careful with placement of needles in the chest. Second one is a needle shock. If you put too many needles, too much electricity in a person who is naive to acupuncture needles, then the person can go into a shock-like state, can have some nausea, vomiting. So you know what traditionally I do is when I bring the patient in, I tell him I'm going to put in a couple of needles and make you familiar with the needles, so that when he actually gets a big needles, a lot of needles, you know, then you can I basically eliminated the possibility of needle shock. Then of course, viral hepatitis if you're not careful with hygiene, but very rare because these are disposable, use and throw, one needle, one use only needles, and a bacterial infection can occur in the ear cartilage. One needs to be careful about that. Effects of treatment: one can anticipate immediate worsening of the pain, improvement or no changes at all. Usually patients report gradual improvement over the next 3 to 4 days, and on the day of the acupuncture they can have a sense of well-being or drowsiness or sleepiness. Thank you.
Question?
Have you done a study like acupuncture, physiotherapy, you know, that sort of anything? Study has been done and seen.
Yeah,
For example, like plantar fasciitis.
Yeah. We can do physical therapy simultaneously. You know, sometimes in the end, it's not about what method you use to help a patient. Finally, it's about helping the patient. So, a couple of patients have come to me right here in RxD. They came with severe back pain, fibromyalgia. We've said go to physical therapy also. Get if the pain is very severe, I've even asked them to use Comiflam or some other NSAIDs. But you can use it as an adjunct. You can use it together, or you can use acupuncture alone.
So we're doing it at RxD? You're doing it here?
Yeah.
Oh,
She's doing it. She said she's doing it.
oh, since when?
Since the beginning. It's not been a lot of patients, but 1 or 2 patients per week.
Oh, see, we
That's
don't know.
good. Yeah.
We,
Yeah.
do the orthopods know you're doing?
Ortho, I don't think so, but Ishwar knows I'm doing acupuncture and Dr. Belly.
Why didn't you send a mail to the Send that you are doing
which
it.
diseases.
To do that.
You know,
And the
because
orthopods also,
Yeah.
because they'll have some of these chronic pain, you know, frozen shoulders,
sports injuries, so many sports injuries.
injuries. Yeah.
Yeah, recently I did a tennis elbow and I'm doing a plantar fascia. They're feeling better.
Who is referring it?
You know, the health checks, when they come for health checks, they tell me all the chronic diseases.
She fixed them.
I said, do you want to try?
That's why I put it down.
Yeah.
What about disc prolapse?
Disc prolapse.
Sorry.
No,
Yeah,
no.
please.
I think you're marketing it.
See, but one thing is they should really have a lot of pain. They should have tried. They usually, you know, these patients announce themselves. I mean, they usually have tried everything. They have failed. They're desperate to get some help, and then they say, I'm willing to try anything. I'll give acupuncture a shot. So then those kind of patients they'll come. Yeah, disc prolapse, any back pain, low back pain, upper back pain can be taken care of by acupuncture.
What about cancer?
Cancer, no. I mean, I'm sure the Chinese know, but I have been trained only in pain management, and I extended to dysmenorrhea, postmenopausal. You know, some things I read on my own, and then I take care of a few things, but not so far-fetched.
Wow. That's nice.
So there was this lady, French, that we started with this French girl. So she had a arm pain. She went to TISB and then she was unable to write her examination. She couldn't sit through the 3 or 4 hours of examination. And then she went to Manipal. They did MRI, all kinds of workup. She went to Dharmanand also, and then he diagnosed her with myofascial pain. And she said, I want help. I want to write this examination. So I asked her, do you want to try acupuncture? And she said yes. So I tried some things, and try to correct her meridians and different things. And she was able to write the examination, so I'll take it as a credit.
Good.
This sort of time.